I have, up until a few weeks ago, been, for the past 7 years, the graduate program coordinator for our department, which means I have had administrative responsibility over our graduate program, which has about 180 students, split more or less evenly between master's and PhD students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of considering prospects for graduate school and the application process for graduate school, and try to give you a few insights that I've gleaned from my interactions with applicants and graduate students during the time that I was graduate program coordinator. And if you have any questions about anything at any point during this, feel free to stop me. Okay, well, the first question one might consider, and perhaps one that's part of the motivation for your participating in the REU program this summer, is determining whether or not graduate school is the right next step for you after you finish a bachelor's degree. And so I want to point out a number of potential benefits to you in going on to graduate school, and then we'll say a little bit about the possible benefits of the alternative as well, and out of fairness. So what are some reasons that you might consider going on to graduate school immediately after completing your bachelor's degree? Well, I think the most compelling reason is that if you are planning to engage in a career as a technically or scientifically oriented engineer or scientist, your prospects for the life of your career and the opportunities that may be available to you during that career will be greater, likely be greater, and perhaps much greater if you hold a graduate degree in your discipline than if you try to pursue a career only with a bachelor's degree. And in fact, because of the fact that technology and scientific content in industry has become more and more deeply embedded in products and services, oftentimes a master's degree is a practical minimum point of entry for those who wish to pursue a successful professional degree in sciences and engineering. So in particular, if you would like to be in a position in industry where you are taking the lead at some point in the future in designing next generation products or services of a technical nature, and my pointer lasted for about 2 seconds. How about that? Okay. That's why we carry a backup. And especially if you're interested in working in some sort of a research laboratory for your career, I mean, it's realistic to say that you're likely to need at least a master's degree. I think the battery, that's okay. This will work. Okay, that's better. Thank you. Now, in fact, if you are interested in a research career and you would like to achieve a position of leadership in a research laboratory in the long run in your career, if you'd like to have a position of scientific or technical leadership in a startup company or a large company over the long run, and most certainly if you're interested in pursuing a career in academia, then for someone in the sciences or engineering, a PhD is a practical necessity. So to a large extent, the choice to go on for graduate studies can be motivated solely by your intent for your own career. Now, there are some other motivating factors as well. The reality is that in our fields, the higher the level of your education, on average, the higher the level of your lifetime earnings in the field. Now, I have listed here some representative values for starting salaries in electrical engineering because it's the one I know have the most data on, and these numbers may actually be a little bit out of date, but that gives you a sense of what the typical difference in starting salaries are for new graduates in electrical engineering, at least, depending upon their degree level. And that same sort of difference is likely to occur in other science and engineering fields, even if the absolute dollar amounts are different somewhat by field. Perhaps more important from a bigger picture standpoint than what one might earn starting off out of school is the fact that over the duration of a career, the more advanced degree is also likely to increase your earning potential. Now there's a short-term trade-off. Obviously, the longer you stay in school, the longer you delay beginning to earn a professional salary. But with the advanced degree, again, on average, you're going to catch up eventually and then surpass the earning opportunities you would have had solely with a bachelor's degree. And again, these are just sort of representative figures. Of course, the actual amount that an individual might earn over his or her career will differ considerably depending upon circumstances. Now, there's one other important reason that students, and in particular academically strong, highly motivated students like you, might want to pursue a graduate degree, and that's the fact that you are interested in the field that you're working in and you simply like to learn more about it. And that's not to be discounted as an important factor, because I think that to be happy in your career, especially in the types of fields that we are working in, we have to find some intellectual satisfaction in the technical, the scientific content behind our careers. And certainly as you go on to higher levels of graduate education, you'll develop a much deeper understanding of the material in your field, and that gives you greater opportunity to mature into a technical or scientific leader in your field in the long run. Okay, let's suppose that you are convinced or reasonably convinced that graduate school is ultimately the right choice for you. Then the question you might ask next is, when should I consider going on to graduate school? So really that boils down to one of two choices. You either continue on to graduate school immediately after completing a bachelor's degree, or you pursue some employment opportunities after the bachelor's degree with the intent of coming back to graduate school at a later point in time. So that really can be thought of as a post-bachelor's degree equivalent of the gap year concept that sometimes is discussed for students between their high school year and their first year of college. So does it make sense for you as a student in a scientific field or an engineering field who is interested in getting a graduate level education to consider waiting some period of time after your bachelor's degree before going on for that graduate education? Well, what are the arguments in favor of doing that? Well, if you really don't have a clear idea of what it is you want to get out of a graduate program, one could argue that working in your field for a period of time will help distill a better understanding in your mind of what it is that's important to you, so that if you then go back to graduate school, you'll be more focused and on getting what you want out of it. And we know this doesn't really matter, but getting a chance to make some money to pay off student loans. I'm joking about it not mattering, but I know that having an opportunity to pay off student loans can really give you a peace of mind going on to your next step. Though do remember that if you go on to graduate school, the typical federal student loans that are deferred through your undergraduate studies are also deferred through graduate studies. So it's not as if you have to start paying when you enter a graduate program. Well, what are the trade-offs in that? If you delay after a bachelor's degree before going on to a graduate degree, the biggest single challenge you face is that even if you're working in a technical area for a full-time employment, you'll find that your academic edge typically will start to dull somewhat very quickly. And that doesn't mean you're not learning things working a full-time job that are relevant to your understanding of the technical content of the field, but some of the specifics that are actually going to be used at the level of graduate study are things you may not be exercising on the job, and we know that we all tend to get a little bit hazy about details of things that we don't use over an extended period of time. So what I have observed is that for students who do take some time off between a bachelor's degree and graduate degree and then come back for a master's or PhD, they often have sort of a hard landing back into academia, and it takes them a semester or even two to get their feet back on the ground and sort of relearn the skills of being a successful student. And I'm talking about good students, I'm not talking about weak students. So that is a real practical consideration. Now another one, and one that you might not necessarily think about at this point, is that personal circumstances might make it impractical for you at some later point in time to pursue what you now are planning for that later point in time. And there are all kinds of personal circumstances that could cause you to be unable 2, 3, 5 years down the line to go back to school when you might have hoped to. And so I've seen life get in the way of people's plans for that in a number of circumstances. And so in some sense you have the greatest level of freedom to do something like graduate studies now that you're likely ever to have in your life. And in some cases there really is not much of a choice. For example, if you're in bioengineering, whether you have your faculty, your professors have discussed this with you or not, most employment is going to require a graduate degree. The employment opportunities with only a bachelor's degree are more limited. And there are a number of fields in which the intent is for everyone going through a bachelor's degree to continue on and get master's level of education. And once again, if you enjoy the technical content of your field and you are happy learning about it, why not continue doing that for a while longer? Okay, does anybody have any questions about those points? Rebuttals? No? Okay. All right, so the two graduate degrees that I mentioned are the master's degree, which for the fields that each of you are in would be a Master of Science degree, or a doctoral degree, a PhD, a Doctorate of Philosophy degree. So if you are to continue on into graduate school, the next choice that you have to make is which degree is your target, both immediately as the degree program you enter first as a graduate student and ultimately as your final destination in graduate studies. So let's consider the comparison between pursuing a master's degree and terminating with a master's degree, or continuing graduate school and through completion of a doctoral degree, whether or not there is a master's degree along the way to that doctoral degree. Well, there are some differences in what holding one or the other of those degrees will imply about the opportunities that are available to you in your career, and some differences in your likely lifetime salary, and those are things that I already pointed out on an earlier view graph. Now, in terms of the study itself, the biggest single difference between a master's and a PhD is the amount of time that you would be in graduate school to complete one versus the other of those two degrees. The nominal time for a Master of Science program at most schools in most science and engineering disciplines is 2 calendar years. So you can think of that in general as roughly what you should anticipate to spend in school if you're going on for a master's degree. If after a bachelor's degree you instead enter a PhD program, you can think about the nominal time period for completion of that as 5 years. Now there's more variability in practice in the time that's required to finish a PhD than is the case for a master's program, but 5 years is still a reasonable average. You're not likely to finish much faster than that. And if you're highly motivated and working hard, you shouldn't take much longer than that to finish the PhD. Now, a lot of students who have a bachelor's degree and want to earn a PhD will first focus on obtaining a master's degree and then move on into a PhD program post-master's. And if you do that, if you go through the sequence of the 2 degrees, you can probably add a little bit of time to those 5 years. It's not the sum of the 2 and the 5 years, because what's required in a PhD program after you have earned a master's degree is almost always substantially less than what's required for the PhD program if you're coming in directly from a bachelor's degree. So you can leverage what you learn, get out of the master's program towards the time to completion for the PhD program. So one thing I'm alluding to with these is the fact that for a student who wants to get a PhD, there are 2 paths to the PhD. One involves coming out of the bachelor's program directly into a PhD, completing whatever degree requirements are imposed on that student. And the other is coming out of the bachelor's into a master's program, completing the master's, and then moving on into the PhD program and completing the likely somewhat different requirements for the PhD that would be required of somebody who already holds a master's degree. Now, both of those options are going to be available in most programs. In particular, most programs in science and engineering have what we would refer to as a direct bachelor's to PhD option, or a direct entry into the PhD program. For those of you who are in the sciences, that's the traditional and normal approach to earning a PhD. Almost everyone who goes on from a bachelor's degree to a PhD in physics, chemistry, biology, for example, will move directly into a PhD program after the bachelor's program. And in those disciplines, normally students entering a master's program are students who intend to terminate their study with the master's program. For engineering programs, this is a more recent innovation. Traditionally, PhD students first went through a master's and then through a PhD, and it's only in the last decade and a half, I would say, that this direct BS to PhD option has become common in engineering disciplines. Now, what you'll find is that for many of the PhD programs, certainly in engineering, perhaps in the sciences, I'm not quite as sure, if you enter from the bachelor's program into the PhD program, there will be an option provided for you to complete the requirements for the master's program and receive a master's degree during the period of time that you're officially classified as a PhD student. At Clemson, we have that option for almost all of our science and engineering programs, and we refer to that master's as a master's en route to a PhD. So in that case, the student applies for and is admitted to a PhD program immediately after the bachelor's degree. As they're taking courses, they complete other requirements such as a master's thesis that would be required for a master's degree, and then they petition the university for the master's degree even as they are classified as a PhD student, and they just continue on with the remaining requirements for the PhD program. And that's not unique to Clemson. That's a fairly common option at most universities. Now, one thing I do want to point out, and it's an important practical consideration, is that with the emphasis that most research-focused universities in the U.S. have on the production of PhDs, those universities have policies in place such that the financial resources they have available to graduate students are typically preferentially focused on PhD students. So if you think that a PhD is an option for you in the long run, there is a practical advantage to you in applying for and being admitted into a PhD program in that case as opposed to the master's program, because you're more likely to receive financial support, or you're likely to receive a better package of financial support as a newly admitted PhD student than you would be as a newly admitted master's student. Now, if you truly have no interest in or intention to go on for a PhD program, I'm not suggesting that you misrepresent your intentions in your application for graduate school, but if that's at least an option that you're weighing for yourself in the long run, then I think this is a factor that you should take into account when you're considering which program to apply for. Okay, any questions? Yes?
How much of a, if you're to, I'm trying to figure out how to word it, if you're applying as a PhD student, how much of your degree is actually paid for by a college on average? Is it most of the cost, or is it?
For strong students like all of you who are in engineering or the sciences, you should have opportunities which would provide support to cover most of your costs as a graduate student. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. If you were going into a different field outside of science and engineering, that would be much less true. Okay, so suppose you have been applied for and been admitted into a graduate program. What's going to be required of you in order to receive that program, receive that degree? Now, if you're in the bachelor's program in whatever discipline you're in now, I would guess that you are having to complete something on the order of 120 to 135 semester credit hours from freshman through senior year, right, to get your degree. That's pretty standard across the country. Well, first of all, the number of course credits that are required for graduate degrees is going to be quite a bit less than for the undergraduate degree. A Master of Science degree typically will require 30 semester credit hours. That is a minimum. There are accreditation processes for graduate programs similar to the ones applied to undergraduate programs, and those accreditation processes typically require a minimum of 30 credit hours for a master's degree, and that is often exactly the number of hours that are required at different schools. A few schools will require more, so maybe up to 36 hours, but 30 is the most common. And if you're pursuing a master's degree with a research-focused master's thesis as part of the master's degree program, then typically of those 30 credit hours, 21 to 24 will consist of letter-graded coursework, and the remaining hours will be pass-fail credit hours that reflect the time and effort you've invested in your research for your master's thesis. Now, at Clemson, most of the graduate classes are 3 credit hours, so that corresponds to 7 or 8 lecture courses, and that, again, is probably typical for most graduate programs around the country. Also, as part of a thesis-based master's degree, you have to conduct and complete the research corresponding to these thesis research credit hours, write a document referred to as a master's thesis, which describes the problem you've been working on for your research and the results of that research, and then give an oral presentation defending your results before a committee of faculty members who have been selected in part by you and your academic advisor to work with you during the course of your program of study. So that really encompasses the set of requirements for receiving a Master of Science degree in science or engineering at most universities in the U.S. Now, I will say if you're considering universities in other countries, I'll be glad to talk with you one-on-one. The requirements are very much more widely once you get outside the U.S. And the entire system may be quite different, in fact, in some countries for graduate education. Now, if you're pursuing a doctoral degree immediately after a bachelor's, the minimum number of credit hours that are required at most universities is 60, and a few universities may require up to 72, but again, 60 is the most common number you'll encounter. Now, there is more variability in the level of coursework that's required for the doctoral degree from one program to another. That number can range anywhere from 24 to 48 credit hours, so that would be between 8 and 16 3-credit courses depending on the program and the school where you're enrolled. At Clemson, for example, if you go through the doctoral degree program in electrical engineering or computer engineering directly out of a bachelor's degree, you have to complete 42 credit hours of coursework. So that corresponds to 14 lecture courses. And that number is probably different for other PhD programs at Clemson. It's probably also different for other electrical and computer engineering programs at other schools. Okay. One of the differences between a doctoral degree and a master's degree is that in most doctoral programs, the student will have to take and pass an exam fairly early in the graduate program demonstrating broad proficiency in some subject matter. And that subject matter can either be core undergraduate level material in the discipline of the PhD program, or it can be core graduate level material, perhaps a little bit more narrowly focused on the student's area of specialization. The terminology that's used to describe this exam is often PhD qualifying exam, sometimes referred to as PhD preliminary exam at some schools. At Clemson, in electrical and computer engineering, we have this exam which must be passed by the second year of the PhD program, and our exam is focused on core undergraduate material, which would break into 11 topics. The student has to choose 3 of those topics and is examined in a written, 2-day written exam on those 3 topics. So that's usually a written exam as opposed to an oral exam at most programs. At a later point in the program of study, the student will typically have to pass a second exam. Now that second exam is referred to as a preliminary exam at some schools, or a comprehensive exam at some schools. At Clemson, it's called a comprehensive exam. And the nature of this second exam varies much more widely from program to program and from school to school. And it can serve as something such as a research proposal to the committee of faculty that the student is working with, where the student says, this is the outline of what I intend to accomplish for my PhD research. Or it can even occur a little bit later in the research process, and the student can maybe reporting on preliminary or intermediate research results and seeking guidance from the committee on where to go, which direction to go to finish up the research. Or it can be something completely different. Within our department, in our PhD program, it's largely at the discretion of the committee. Some committees have assigned a student an unrelated topic to spend 1 month researching literature on, and then come back and give a report on that topic, which may not even have anything to do with the student's dissertation, PhD research topic. So whatever the difference is between the required number of credit hours and the required number of letter-graded course hours is the number of pass-fail research credit hours that the student must pass. And that's intended to reflect the effort and outcomes of the PhD research that the student's conducting. Again, the student conducts research on a particular topic, obtains results on that research. That research is going to be more in depth than the research would be for a master's thesis research, and typically is going to have more stringent requirements for the originality of the result. That is, results that extend the body of knowledge in some meaningful way in some part of the student's area of specialization. Again, the student has to write a document describing the research and the results of the research, and that is referred to as a doctoral dissertation, and then provide an oral presentation or defense of the content of that document before a committee of faculty. Now, in either case, whether it's a master's degree or the doctoral degree, the oral defense is usually the last step in the degree program, and once the committee signs off or passes the student's oral presentation and then signs off on the document, the master's thesis or the doctoral dissertation, as being acceptable, there's typically a final format check of that document by the graduate school at the university. Then the student deposits, as they say, that document and has completed the degree requirements at that point. So again, this is an outline of what's typically required for a Master of Science degree, most programs, and this is an outline of what's required for a Doctor of Philosophy degree. If you go through a Master of Science degree and then enter the Doctor of Philosophy degree, typically there's a reduction in the number of letter-graded course hours that have to be completed and a reduction in the number of overall course hours that have to be completed to account for what's already been accomplished in the master's program. But the sum of the two in that case may still add up to a little bit more coursework than would have been required just for the our graduate programs in ECE here. A typical full-time course load is three credit lecture courses. So in the first year of a student's graduate program for a master's or PhD, the student is typically taking 3 lecture courses each semester, and realistically only engaging in a modest level of effort in the research, because that coursework is intended to build up some of the background necessary to go in the greater depth that's required for the research. And then after the first year, the level of coursework starts to taper off, and the student's emphasis switches to more and more heavily towards the thesis or dissertation research. And for the master's program, the last 6 months, the student may be doing nothing but research and working on the master's thesis. For a PhD, for the last year and a half, the student may be doing nothing but research and working or writing. With this background, if you've made the decision to apply for graduate school, you know when you're going to pursue a graduate degree, and you know which graduate degree you're going to start out pursuing, at least. The next question you might ask is, which of the several hundred science-oriented graduate programs and the several hundred engineering graduate programs around the country in your discipline are the right ones for you to consider? So where should you apply to graduate school? Well, I think the key thing is that you want to focus on graduate programs that match your professional interests. And there are 2 specific things that I would encourage you to pay attention to in that regard. The first and most obvious perhaps is that any graduate program that you're considering should be one that is actually a strong program in your area of specialization. And by area of specialization, I mean something narrower than your discipline. So, for example, if you're in bioengineering, bioengineering is a discipline. Tissue engineering is an area of specialization. So, if you looked at the bioengineering graduate programs around the country, you would probably find that some have very strong research programs in tissue engineering, some have weak programs in that area, and some just don't have anything going on at all in that particular area. And the same would be true of any other area of specialization in any discipline. So first and foremost, you need to identify schools that will provide you with preparation in what you're actually interested in. And as a practical matter, I would strongly recommend that you identify programs where there are at least 2 possible faculty members who you could work with as a research supervisor. Now, I'm not suggesting that you will work with 2 faculty members. I'm suggesting that it's good to ensure that the program has more than one person on faculty who would be appropriate for you to work with. And perhaps the reasons for that are obvious, because if you enter a program and what you expect to get out of that program depends heavily on your ability to work with a particular advisor, there are any of a number of reasons that might not work out. You and that advisor may not turn out to be a good match for each other. That advisor might leave the university. That advisor might retire or have health problems or something like that, and in any event might not be available to you. So it's good to be in a position where you have at least one viable backup. So that's something I think you should pay attention to as you're researching prospective programs. Now, one thing I want to also mention before we move on is that even if you look at what might generally be considered the very strongest graduate programs in the country in your discipline, and if you listed the top 5 by reputation, the 5 schools are probably not going to vary much from one discipline to the next. It might be MIT, Stanford, etc. No program, no matter how strong its reputation or how large it is going to have strong research activity in every area of specialization in your discipline. So just because a school has a big name does not mean you don't have to do the research to understand what's going on in that program before you apply, because they still might, that program still might not be a good match for you. Okay, now of course many students have restrictions such as geographical preferences. If you know that you want to go to graduate school in the Midwest and you know you're not going to go to school anyplace else, don't waste your money and time applying to schools someplace else, right? Now, I'm not suggesting you should restrict yourself artificially, but be realistic. I mean, there's a lot of energy you're going to need to invest into looking at prospective graduate schools, and a lot of money you potentially could invest in applications. And you want to utilize your time and your financial resources effectively in that process. Well, what are some resources that you can draw on to help you make a good decision about which schools to apply to? Well, the very best resource that you have available to you is the set of faculty members in your current undergraduate program. No matter where you are in school, the faculty in your program have a broad understanding of what's going on in your discipline across the country, and faculty in your program in a particular area of specialization have typically a strong understanding of what schools have viable research activity in your area of specialization. And all of your faculty, they know a little bit more than you think they do about these things. So don't be shy about asking faculty in your current department their opinions about what schools you should consider. And of course, faculty who know you well as a student are probably going to be able to give more insightful advice to you than ones who don't. But even ones you don't know could still provide you with some good suggestions at times. Fortunately, you have access to a wealth of information on the web. Unlike many sources of information on the web, the information that's available at university websites is typically pretty reliable. So going to the web pages for the department and the faculty members within the department at some program, the faculty members who are in your area of specialization, and drilling down and reading about their research, looking at the course requirements for the program and so forth, can be very worthwhile. And of course, that's an easy way to get at a lot of information. So I would encourage you to spend time researching on the web as well. And what you might do in part is start with the suggestions from your faculty, from your professors, and use that as a starting point for looking at information on the web. Now, another step you can take is to actually talk with people at the various programs you might be interested in, such as the people who served as my counterpart, the faculty member who has oversight over the graduate program in a particular department, or the individual faculty members who are conducting research in the area of specialization you're interested in. What you'll find is that the graduate program coordinators or a staff representative working with that person should be fairly responsive to your inquiries. For those of you participating in this program, since you're good students, it would be advantageous when you contact one of them and introduce yourself that you provide just enough information to let them understand that you're a strong student academically, because they will respond more quickly as a result of that than if you were not in general. So you should find that the graduate program coordinators or lead faculty member for the graduate program will respond to you fairly quickly. Just as a word of warning, if you contact individual faculty members who you might be interested in working with in the graduate program, the level of responsiveness that you would encounter at this point is going to vary dramatically from faculty member to faculty member. And that doesn't mean that a faculty member who does not respond or does not respond in a timely manner is disinterested in you fundamentally, but many faculty are just overwhelmed with inquiries, and at this stage in the process you may or may not stand out by an email. Now, you can try telephone calls, but cold calls are generally not as well received as email, where the recipient feels like he or she has control over the timing of the response. But so just be aware that at this point in the process, not everybody is going to reply to you. Then one other thing I'll point out is that you really should exercise some judiciousness about which schools you're going to focus on, because there are literally hundreds of programs around the country, and you could easily be overwhelmed by the task of trying to evaluate all of them. Ultimately, what I think you should try to do is focus on 4 to 6 of the programs as your targets. If you're preparing an application, what does that involve? Well, every application is going to include a requirement that you provide what's typically called a statement of purpose. And that is an essay format statement that you would provide that should discuss your background as it relates to what you want to accomplish in the graduate program, why you're interested in pursuing a graduate program, and what you're going to do with the graduate degree after you receive it. Now, granted, you may not know for certain what the last of those is, but it's good to try to articulate some vision for yourself for the future. And I would suggest that you keep this relatively short. Very few people have time to read a 3-page biography, so just a page, 2 or 3 succinct paragraphs will be fine. Every application has an application fee, and for most schools they're typically between $50 and $100. So if you apply to a lot of schools, that does start to add up. In some instances, some schools have opportunities for waivers, in particular if you can document financial hardship or something like that, but many other schools do not for graduate applications. Every program in engineering and science is going to require that you take and provide scores for a standardized test called the graduate record exam. So you can think of the graduate record exam as being the graduate school equivalent of the SAT. That's not entirely, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's reasonably close. So it is an exam that has what's called a general exam component, which is what all of the applications will require. And then also there are a number of subject exams which almost no engineering graduate application will require, but some science engineering or science graduate applications may require. The subject exam for engineering is an all-encompassing engineering exam. It's not discipline specific. MIT is the only school I know that requires that, and I'm not sure they do anymore for some of their engineering programs. Some of the science graduate programs may require that. Thank you. Keep it away. The exam is formatted to include a math section, which used to be basic math, but now I think goes up through calculus, first year calculus. A vocabulary and verbal section, and then what's called analytical writing. And the analytical writing section involves writing 2 short essays in real time based on a topic that is assigned at the time of the exam. So all of this is computer based. So the exams are administered through a particular company called Prometrica Testing Centers, and they have testing sites at specific locations around the country. The exam itself is offered by a company called the Educational Testing Service. So you can go to the Educational Testing Service website to register to take the exam at one of the Prometrica testing centers around the country. You don't find them everywhere, usually only in cities. The nearest one to here is in Greenville, South Carolina. So you'll probably have to go to a city if you're going to school in a campus town environment like this. But there should be one reasonably nearby, unless you're in the middle of Montana or something. Nobody's in school in Montana here. Right? Okay. In other words, as long as you're not too far away from a city. It's not cheap. It's $185. As far as I know, there's no way to get around paying that fee. Or if there is, I'm not aware of it. Advice I would give you includes prepare for this exam. Even though it is a general exam, it's useful to understand something about the content and the format before you go in. And you can purchase sample exams. In the old days, they were paper exams. It may be that the sample exams now are ones you can load onto your computer and run in the same format as the actual exams are given. I'm not sure about that. But there are sample exams available, so it would be worth going through 1 or 2 of those just to kind of understand the flow of how things work in the exam. And I would encourage you to register to take the exam well before the date that you want to take it, because there are a limited number of computer seats available at each of the testing centers, and if you wait until a short time before you want to take the exam, you may not find seats available in the city where you want to take the exam. So you can look at this website and get more information about the logistics of that. Now, every graduate application will require letters of recommendation from individuals who know something about you, and in most cases that's between 2 and 4. My program, for example, requires 2 letters of recommendation. Now, even though you could choose people from all avenues of your personal and professional or academic life to write letters for you, I would strongly encourage you to focus on choosing faculty members as the people who will write your letters for you, because they are the people who are in the best position to address those aspects of your capabilities and background that are most directly relevant to what you'll be doing as a graduate student. Perhaps the one exception to that is if you have worked in an internship deadlines that have deadlines later than January the 31st. And these are deadlines to apply to enter the graduate program in the following fall semester. So if you're considering entering in fall 2015, this means between December 1st of this year and January 31st of next year. Now, some graduate programs, such as our program, have what are called rolling admissions. Now, a rolling admission system does not have a fixed deadline, so at least in concept, you could apply relatively late, say March or April, and you would still be considered, and your application would be evaluated for admission without any bias against you because of the fact you submitted a little bit later, but there are still consequences for waiting. So you really want to focus on this timeline for all of your applications. And I'll say primarily the reason for doing that with rolling admissions is that all of the opportunities for financial support may go away if you wait until later than that to apply. So in part because of that very consideration, I strongly encourage you to focus on January 1st as your own personal deadline for all graduate school applications. Obviously, those that have earlier deadlines, you'll have to finish earlier, but even for ones with later deadlines or rolling admissions, I would encourage you to finish those applications before the first of the year. And part of the reason for that is that even if schools have a later deadline or rolling admissions, they will often start making admission decisions earlier for those applications that are already complete, and may start making offers of financial support as well, which means they start locking up some of the resources that are available for financial support. So you want your application, you want to ensure your applications are in time that you receive the fullest possible consideration for financial support. Well, what are the forms of financial support that are available? There are really three basic forms: teaching assistantships, research assistantships, and fellowships. A teaching assistantship is normally offered by a department or degree program and is a form of employment of the graduate student where the graduate student performs services to support the academic program of that department. The most common type of assignment for a teaching assistant is to teach sections of undergraduate laboratories, and that's true in both engineering and the sciences. So I'm sure most of you have encountered TAs in labs that you've taken in your undergraduate program. Most teaching assistantship appointments are for the academic year only and do not include the summer, partly because there's less need for the services of TAs during the summer than during the academic year. And at least in the engineering disciplines, a typical teaching assistantship will pay $10,000 to $20,000 for an academic year. For a work assignment that's nominally considered a 20-hour per week work assignment. A 20-hour per week work assignment would normally be a full work assignment for a TA. For example, in our program, a TA who has a 20-hour a week work assignment would normally teach 3 sections of undergraduate laboratory. So each of those is one that would meet 2 hours once a week. And then they would also be available to serve as a proctor for exams in one large section undergraduate course. So that would be the level of work assignment that would be given to a TA that had a 20-hour per week assignment. Now, in addition to receiving a stipend or salary, the teaching assistantship at almost all universities includes a waiver or a substantial reduction in the tuition and fees. So again, for example, at Clemson, if you are on a teaching assistantship where your work assignment is 10 hours per week or more, the tuition and fees are not eliminated, but they're reduced to a level of about $2,500 over the academic year. And that compares with for an out-of-state student paying full fare, something like $20,000 if they were self-supporting. Research assistantships are assistantships to work in a research laboratory of a faculty member on a project of interest to that faculty member. And unlike the teaching assistantships, the research assistantships are generally funded by resources that are controlled by an individual faculty member. So it's the faculty, at the discretion of the faculty member, to offer a research assistantship to whoever he or she wants, as opposed to the TAs, which are decision offers that are made at the departmental level. The money typically for the research assistantships typically comes from outside research grants and contracts that that faculty member has gotten, say from the National Science Foundation, for example, which will include a budget that includes money for research assistant support. Usually the faculty member supporting an RA is also the person who is the thesis or dissertation research supervisor for that student, though not always. Not always. Unlike teaching assistantships, it's more common for research assistantships to span the entire calendar year, including the summer, because obviously one can work on a research lab just as well in summer as during the academic year. And partly as a result of that, the typical annual stipends for research assistantships are somewhat higher than they are for teaching assistantships. Though there's more variability at in any given program in RA stipends than TA stipends, because TA stipends are standardized by department, whereas in many departments the faculty member has flexibility in setting the stipend level for a research assistant. And again, a full assistantship workload typically would be what's considered a 20-hour per week assignment. And again, students on research assistantships typically qualify for the same waiver or reduction in tuition and fees that is provided to students on a teaching assistantship. So it's a really good deal. I mean, if you, at Clemson, for example, if you're getting, you can compare someone who's self-paying is going to be out $20,000 out of pocket if they're supporting their, per year, if they're supporting themselves per academic year, if they're supporting their own way through school, in comparison with if they had a research assistantship at $25,000 a year, they're clearing $25,000 minus $2,200, so that's about $22,500. So that's a net difference of about $42,000 per year between self-paying and having a research assistantship. So that's a big difference in terms of the student loans that one would or would not have coming out of school. And these numbers are not unique to Clemson. They're very similar at most large universities. Okay, and then fellowships are like undergraduate scholarships. They are awards of financial support that have no work obligation associated with them. Many schools, most schools I would say, have what I would call supplemental fellowships, in which students who the school is trying to recruit into their graduate program are offered a teaching or research assistantship and then a modest additional sum of money as a fellowship, as a sweetener to try to make the financial support offer more attractive to that student. Now, there are fewer but some opportunities at some schools for a full ride fellowship, in which enough money is provided through a fellowship to cover the entire living expenses of the student, and typically in those cases the fellowship also covers tuition and fees for the students. More opportunities for full ride fellowship though contacting individual faculty members in your area of interest may help stimulate their interest in considering you for a research assistantship. They can't offer you a research assistantship if they don't know about you, right? Now in the case of fellowships, again, for these supplemental fellowships, in most schools you'll be considered automatically if you're admitted into the program, whereas those that are offered by external organizations will typically require a separate application by you, which will be of a similar nature to the application for the graduate programs. Yes?
External organizations such as...
I'll give some examples on the next slide.
Okay.
Sorry, 2 slides from now. Most of them are federal government agencies. So let's talk a little bit about these major external fellowships. Often they're referred to as national fellowships. The best ones and the ones that would provide the best opportunities in terms of the number that are awarded nationally for those of you in science, the sciences and engineering, are typically fellowships that provide support for 3 years, have stipends, that is actual cash support that's given to the student on the order of $30,000 per year, and provide funds to pay all tuition and fees for your graduate study in those years. So that type of award, if you're fortunate enough to get one, will see you the majority of the way through a PhD program, after which point one would presumably move on to a teaching assistantship or a research assistantship for the remainder of the program. For all of these awards, realistically, the starting point for consideration is a GPA of about 3.8. So just be aware of that. Because you have the biggest pool that I'll talk about in a minute from the National Science Foundation has about 12,000 applications per year, leading to about 2,000 fellowship awards, and essentially all 12,000 of those applicants are 12,000 of the best seniors in the country in science and engineering, so it's a very competitive pool. The deadlines for application for these major fellowships are in a time range similar to the graduate school application deadlines, and they require submission of similar material, except they do require more extensive essays about your academic experience, your research experience, your graduate school plans, your career plans, and so forth. So this is a case where multiple page essays may actually come into play and be beneficial. It's useful if you're going to pursue some of these to identify a faculty member at in your current department to work with as a mentor to help you in this process. If nothing else, to look at drafts of the essays you're writing to provide you with feedback about how well you are articulating what you have experienced and what you want to get out of your graduate program. Many schools also will provide workshops early in the fall semester that students can attend, where they provide some prep to help you understand how to apply for these fellowships, because schools like to see their students win these fellowships because it's prestigious for the schools to get as many of their students as possible as fellowship winners. Yes?
This is your senior year.
This is your senior year, yes. So it's the same time period in which you would be applying for graduate studies. Okay. Clemson, for example, has a couple of workshops in September of each year that are available to seniors to help them understand the process of applying, in particular for the National Science Foundation fellowships. There are a number of other fellowship opportunities that either have smaller stipends or make a much smaller number of awards annually. Just as a couple of examples, the GEM Fellowship is focused on students from underrepresented groups, and it's closely tied in with corporate sponsors. The amount of money that it provides isn't as big as some of these others, but yet it still carries a lot of prestige and carries along with it some automatic internship opportunities as well during the summer. The American Physical Society provides graduate fellowships that do provide stipends in this level for students in the physical sciences, but the number of awards that is made nationally is much smaller than the ones that I've listed here. The one I'll point out there's a caveat about it, is the Hertz Foundation Fellowship is limited to students who intend to attend a graduate program at one of a number of specific schools. So you'd want to check and see whether or not any of the schools that you're applying for are actually on the list that's acceptable for that program.
Several slides down we have that information. Okay, so what do you do after you're accepted into a program? Or multiple programs, we would hope, so you have some choices. Well, most schools will issue acceptance decisions by March 15th if you've met their deadline, if you got the application in by the dates I was discussing. And because all of you are strong students, I'm confident that you will receive some kind of offer of financial support from some schools if you apply to several schools. Maybe you will from all the schools you apply to. I would encourage you to focus your attention on those schools that have offered you financial support for two reasons. The first and most basic one is that if you go through a graduate program with financial support as opposed to being self-paying and having to accumulate perhaps additional student loan debt to finance graduate school, I think that's going to put you in a frame of mind that will allow you to be more enthusiastic about your graduate studies and to focus your attention more effectively on your graduate studies as well. And the second reason is that if they're willing to offer you some of their financial resources, that means they really see something in you they like, and they would like to have you there. And I think that you would get more out of the program you're attending that is someplace where they really want you to be part of that program. That's probably, this is the point at which you're much more likely to see responsiveness from faculty members if you contact them. Because if you can contact them and say, I have been admitted to your program, or even more if you can say, I have been admitted to your program and I've been offered financial support, say by your department or something, then the faculty member knows you're a serious prospect at that point, and you're going to see a higher level of responsiveness from the faculty. And that's usually the point at which you can really start talking in depth with them about specific research topics that might be available and things of that sort. Now, if you have identified schools that you're going to give serious consideration to, I strongly encourage you to visit each of those schools and to visit those schools no later than April 15th for a reason I'll give in a moment. The reason I suggest you visit the schools at all is if you're not already familiar with a campus, have not already talked to faculty members on the campus, and perhaps in some cases not even visited that campus before, that's not a situation you want to be in starting graduate school. I would advise that you never make a decision to attend a school that you haven't visited. Now that's not disastrous. We have international students that are of necessity have to make that decision all the time, but if you're applying to U.S. universities, you're close enough in general that it's practical for you to visit the schools that you're going to focus on. I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. Most programs will have a single orientation day in late March for newly admitted graduate students, and if you've been offered financial support, oftentimes they will provide you with some funds to offset travel costs to attend that orientation program. In a few cases, they may pay all the travel costs. So if you've been admitted someplace you're interested in, find out when their orientation day is if they don't tell you. And once you've found out what that is, if they haven't offered you funds to offset travel costs, ask them about it. And again, the primary values of attending are to get to see the campus and the community in which the campus is located, and to meet with faculty in your area of specialization. If you were accepted into a program you're really interested in, but you did not receive an offer of financial support, one tactic you might want to consider is to plan a visit to the campus anyway, in coordination with some of the faculty, perhaps the graduate program coordinators, so that you know that people will be available for you to meet with, and try to make your case to them. You know, persuasive face-to-face argument can sometimes change a decision that was made based on data that's on paper. So that's, you could say that's a long shot approach, but I know of examples where that has worked. So keep that in mind if you find yourself in that situation. Now, the reason I mentioned April 15th here is that there's a national agreement that essentially all graduate programs abide by, that the decision date for assistantship offers for the following fall semester is always April 15th. And they treat those as binding decisions. So if you accept something on April 1st and withdraw that acceptance on April 7th, that's fine. But if you accept it on April 14th and then April 15th passes by, then the community of schools is supposed to view that as a binding commitment, where you then have to demonstrate that you've been, if you want to change to something else, you have to get a letter of release from the school you've made the commitment to, and present that to the school that you later have decided you want to attend. It's not always enforced, but that's the protocol. So in any event, you want to visit before April 15th, because that's the date by which you're going to be required to say yes or no for financial aid offer. So that leads to the following overall timeline. If you're interested in entering graduate school in fall 2015, you should spend January 2014 through October researching graduate programs, and I'm sorry, that means you're already 5 months late. That's okay, you still have time, but if you have already been investigating programs, then great, that does give you a head start. But that's really the window of opportunity for you to decide what schools are the right ones for you to apply to, because after that, you're going to have to be focused on getting your applications done. So during the summer, this summer, you should start preparing for the graduate record exam. Again, I encourage you to take some practice exams, and by the 1st of August, register. I'm not suggesting you necessarily need to take the exam by August 1st, but determine a date and get registered for it by that time, so you don't get into a crunch later on where you're having a hard time finding a seat that you can register for. By the end of the summer, you should identify which faculty members are going to serve as reference letter writers for your applications. And if you're applying for any fellowships, you should also recruit a faculty mentor, as I mentioned before, to help provide you with feedback on the essays that you're writing for those fellowships, especially regarding the technical content. So certainly you should take the graduate record exam no later than October. It wouldn't be bad to take it before the end of the summer, just to get that out of the way before the school year gets started back. But if you're going to do that, you need to start preparing now, and you need to go ahead and get a time slot reserved soon. Again, most of the fellowship and graduate applications have deadlines starting in late November, and I encourage you to have everything done by the end of the year, by the end of December. Then you'll start hearing back from schools regarding acceptance and offers of financial support, and that will give you a window of time of 1 to 2 months, depending on when you hear back, to visit schools that are, if you determine they're of greatest interest to you, and then make your final decision by April 15th. Anybody have a question about that timeline? Okay.
Actually,
yes.
So if I were to take the GRE this fall and then put off going to grad school for a year, would I have to take it again the year immediately prior to where I entered?
No, it is valid for 5 years. Okay, so just a little information if you're interested in applying to graduate school at Clemson. This is the common application portal for Clemson, and then here's information about various graduate degree programs, which I think probably encompass the undergraduate majors of most of you, if any of you are interested in a degree program in Clemson that's not listed here, just let me know and I'll get you the information about that one. Okay, now here's the list I promised earlier. So here are links to information about some of the major external fellowships. And for students in science and engineering, the NSF fellowship represents the best opportunity because there are about 2,000 of those awarded annually across the engineering and science disciplines. Probably the second best opportunity is through this program from the Department of Defense, and it's very similar in its nature and the application process to the NSF, so you can share between the two applications. And about 300 of these are awarded nationally. This one may not encompass life sciences. So if you're interested in pure biology, for example, you have to check into it that there may not be an opportunity for you in that program. But there certainly is in this one. The Department of Energy offers some similar fellowships, and a little bit, there are fewer of them, and they are a little bit more focused on areas of specialization that are directly relevant to power and energy. And the Hertz Foundation Fellowship is a private foundation. Again, you have to be attending, you have to attend one of the list of 40 or 50 graduate programs to receive those. I mentioned the GEM Fellowship and the APS Fellowship. In addition, you just go to aps.org to look at that one. And there are a variety of other specialized ones. There are databases out there that list hundreds of fellowship opportunities, many of which have highly specific requirements. And so, you know, you can scan through those and you'll find that 95% of them don't apply to you. So just some background. I'm not going to go through this. For those of you who may be interested in graduate studies in electrical engineering, possibly computer engineering, but probably not for those who are up in this REU. This is sort of a summary of the current areas of active research activity in our program. So again, I'll be glad to talk with you about that in greater depth if you're interested. And these are the specific degree requirements in the electrical and computer engineering program at the master's and doctoral level. Okay, so I'll open the floor to any other questions that you might have.
I was just going to say, is there any way you could have this slideshow sent out to us?
Yes. Sif, would you mind emailing that
Yes.
to all the students?
I would.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Do you have any thoughts on, so at the University of Washington there's an applied master's degree program for material science where you have 1 year of coursework where you're at the school, and then it ends in an internship. But the whole program, I think, officially only takes a year. Mm-hmm. Is there any, like, do people look down on that, on having taken part in programs that are only 1 year versus the normal 2 years, or?
Well, I obviously I don't know the specifics of that program, but I would say whether or not a program of that type would be appropriate would depend in part on what your objectives are, what you want to get out of the graduate program. If the coursework and then if the nature of the internship that is at the end of that coursework involves the same sorts of things that you would envision yourself doing afterwards in your career, then it sounds like that would be an appropriate choice, especially if you want to terminate with a master's degree. If you want to terminate with a master's degree, perhaps be looking at a research laboratory or something like that, that's probably not the right program, because they're going to look for, other than PhD students, they're going to look for master's students who have that research-based thesis experience. And if you're interested in going on for a PhD, that's probably not the right foundational master's program for them. take that next step. So that sounds like more like intended to be a terminal degree for people moving into what I would call standard industry practice after.
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
Yeah,
of it.
yeah. So, you know, if that, and I'm not trying to denigrate that in any way, but I mean, if that's, you know, if that's the goal then that you have professionally, then that may well be a good path for you. Any others? Yeah.
When you or a research committee personally are looking at a potential student, what's the list of most important things? Like, there's all these things we need to apply, but what's kind of like the tests? Like, if they don't have this GPA, they're kind of not looked at. They don't have any research. They're kind of not.
Well, it's not really a hard threshold of GPA. There's probably something similar at most schools that the programs will not normally consider admitting a student with below 3.0 undergraduate GPA into a graduate program. And that doesn't mean that everybody with a GPA of 3.0 and above is going to be admitted. It's just that's a standard threshold. The first thing we look at is academic performance, undergraduate academic performance. So grades. So you know, obviously, the better the grades, the better. Consistency, good grades, especially in the courses that are going to be most directly relevant to the program. If you want to go to graduate school in quantum physics and you're a physics major and the worst grades you got in your major were in quantum physics as an undergraduate, then that's probably not, you know, not going to sell very well when your application is being evaluated. But realistically, most of the students who are admitted into our program have GPAs of 3.5 or higher. That threshold may differ significantly from program to program. If you apply to the CES program at MIT, you're probably going to need a 3.8 or 3.9 GPA unless there's some special circumstance that would cause them to consider you otherwise. So academic performance is the single most important thing. Prior research experience is good. It's a differentiator among students who have a good academic record. It's not compensation for a weak academic record. But if you do have a good academic record, two applications with a good academic record, those students are probably both going to get admitted, but the one who demonstrates a little bit greater depth because of past research experience and so forth is probably going to be given preference for financial support. Certainly is likely to be given preference for consideration for a research assistantship by faculty members trying to find somebody to work in the lab with them. So those are the most important things. GRE scores are things we look at. Really want to see in electrical engineering, want to see good quantitative scores because math skills are very important.
What's that score range? I don't know.
It changed the scale. It's now
170 and 170.
Pardon me?
170 and 170.
Yeah, 170, which is a bizarre number, and it's a highly nonlinear scale in terms of interpretation of the score. I always have to look at the table and map it back to the old score so I have some intuitive understanding of what that means. So most of the engineering disciplines are going to look very heavily at quantitative scores.
What would be considered like a good score?
Quantitative score out of that scale, maybe 163 or above. I'm not.
Oh.
670 or above under the old system, so I'll have to go back and look at the mapping to see.
Do you know what that corresponds to, like a percentile? Because that would.
Yeah, that's probably about a 93 percentile, but remember that's across people from all disciplines, including non-scientific disciplines, taking that program. So
it's like having a low. What were the other ones? Like literacy and things like that?
Verbal and analytical writing. What programs are looking for could be all over the map on that. I mean, you want people in engineering science to have good verbal and writing skills too, because professional tech, the capability to engage in effective professional technical communication is a critical skill. If you're going to do graduate level research, you're going to have to write a doctoral dissertation or master's thesis. You're going to have to write papers for submission to conferences and journals. You're going to have to give oral presentations. So I don't know if I can just as easily point to a benchmark. Better is better, right? So,
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, if you have any questions, if you think of anything later, don't hesitate to contact me. My email address is right there. I have an office on the 3rd floor of this building, but with my new responsibilities, I'm usually in Riggs Hall, which is a block from here. But in either case, I'd be glad to sit down and talk with you. And in fact, I'll probably follow up with each of you towards the end of the summer just to find out a little bit more about what your experience has been with programming here and what you're planning to do next. And that includes both of those of you who are in electrical engineering and other majors. Thank you for your time.